Well, welcome back to week 9 of our study of the book of Revelation here at St. Thomas Episcopal Church. My name's Vaughn, and we're just absolutely delighted that you're here for week 9. We just have 2 weeks left. It's amazing that we're this close to the end of the book of Revelation already. But with the Battle of Armageddon last week, of course, we're toward the end. I want to start today with a very quick review of just the last couple of weeks, because that'll set the context for what we're going to do this week as well as next week. And that review for weeks 7 and 8, we're going to start with chapter 12. And just remember for a moment that in chapters 12 and 13, there were these 7 scenes of cosmic conflict that started with a woman who was pregnant, and then we saw a dragon, and very quickly there was this sort of evil triumvirate of a dragon and a beast from the sea and a beast from the earth, and then there was its mark of 666, and we really just weren't exactly sure what was happening as we worked our way through those chapters. But then we got to chapter 14 last week, chapters 14, 15, and 16, and they opened up by showing us the Lamb once again, the Lamb from chapter 5 and from chapter 7. And this time the Lamb is standing on top of Mount Zion with its army of white-robed martyrs, the army that had been put together in chapter 7. And there were these scenes of divine harvest and divine vintage, and then 7 bowls of plagues. And we ended chapter 16 with that massive battle of Armageddon. And everything was good at that point. But then we set the Bible aside for a day or two, and we began thinking about it and realized, oh my goodness, there are still a whole lot of things that we need to know. And when we jumped back into the book of Revelation, we saw that there are still 6 chapters to go in that book, and we thought, what on earth could possibly be happening at this point? Because in the books that we read and in the films that we watch, it is almost always the case that the ultimate moment in that movie or the ultimate moment in that book takes place right exactly on the last page or within just a page or two. We're not used to having what seems like the ultimate scene taking place at about the 3/4 mark of the book or of the film that we're watching. But that is precisely what we're facing here within the book of Revelation. But there was the Battle of Armageddon, and there was the pouring out of the 7th seal and the end of time, as it were, in chapter 16. So what on earth do we have left to look at from this point on? Well, what we have left is, first of all, just a notion we need to keep very much in the forefront of our minds, and that is that by the time we get to the end of chapter 16, with the wonderful Battle of Armageddon, which, as we saw last week, is not a battle to end all battles at the very end of time that is going to be this terrible thing to have to live through, but is in fact the cross of Jesus Christ that has won for us the victory that we all can take great delight in. We realize that we really have nothing at all to fear in this world because God has taken care of it. In fact, we could say God has this. And with that in mind, that allows us to now jump into these final 6 chapters, which are, as it were, a sorting out of what is left to be told. Chapters 17 and 18, which we're going to be looking at today, are going to provide for us now a negative description, if you will, of the fall of Babylon. That dragon-empowered, unrepentant people that is dead set against God and God's people. And then in chapters 19, 20, 21, and 22, we're going to change direction. We're no longer going to be looking at the fall of Babylon, but we're going to be looking at a rather positive description of the ultimate triumph of Christ and the establishment of the new earth. And that's going to be tendered over the concluding 4 chapters of the book of Revelation. So that'll give you a sense of where we're headed. With that, let's just jump in and read the text today. Chapter 17 of the book of Revelation. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." And then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. This title was written on her forehead: Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. And when I saw her, I was greatly astonished. And then the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come." Now this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will overcome them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. And then the angel said to me, "The waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They'll bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They'll eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to give the beast their power to rule until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." And after this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a home for demons and a haunt for every evil spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." And then I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Pour her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torture and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, 'I sit enthroned as a queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn.' Therefore in one day her plagues will overtake her, death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. And when the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, 'Woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon! In 1 hour your doom has come.' The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh, and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and human beings sold as slaves. And they will say, The fruit you longed for is gone from you. All your luxury and splendor have vanished, never to be recovered. The merchants who sold these things and gained their wealth from her will stand far off, terrified at her torment. They'll weep and mourn and cry out, "Woe, woe to you, great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. In 1 hour such great wealth has been brought to ruin." And every sea captain and all who travel by ship, the sailors and all who earn their living from the sea will stand far off. When they see the smoke of her burning, they will exclaim, "Was there ever a city like this great city?" And they will throw dust on their heads, and with weeping and mourning cry out, "Woe, woe to you, great city, where all who had ships on the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour she has been brought to ruin." Rejoice over her, you heavens. Rejoice, you people of God. Rejoice, apostles and prophets. For God has judged her with the judgment she imposed on you. And then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea and said, "With such violence, the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. The music of harpists and musicians, pipers and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. No worker of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. The voice of bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again. Your merchants were the world's important people. By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray. In her was found the blood of prophets and of God's people, of all who have been slaughtered on the earth." Well, all right, back to the beginning of chapter 17. There is a scene that opens up this chapter that will encompass verses 1 through 6. It's of a prostitute, really a glamorous-looking prostitute that is sitting on a scarlet beast. Verses 1 and 2 open up with an angel telling John that he is about to witness the punishment of this prostitute, which really at this point remains unnamed. All we're told on the front end is that she is sitting upon the waters, or sitting beside the waters, depending upon your translation. That really is a caricature of God. You may remember that when we first saw God in heaven back in chapter 6, there was this sea of glass before God. And then in chapter 15, at the beginning of that chapter, there was again this sea of glass that was in front of the 144,000, that army of God. Well, here again, now there is a sea that is before, this time, a prostitute. They're going to be interpreted a little bit later in this chapter as godless persons, but I'll get to that in a bit. Here, I think what we need to see is one more indication of how the dragon and the beast, and now the prostitute as well, are trying their best to look like God is. It's all facade, but we've seen kind of an evil trinity. We've seen an attempt to be omniscient and omnipotent, but everything keeps falling just shy. And here is yet one more attempt to be able to try to pull the wool over the world and appear to be God by having this sea in front of them. But we're going to see in just a moment it doesn't work. She's called a prostitute because God's people are to be, as it were, married to God. And idolatry, the choosing of other gods, is often referred to throughout the pages of the Old Testament as a form of prostitution or of adultery. Here it's primarily a societal thing. It's the kings who are committing adultery with Rome. But there's a sense in which it's also an individual thing. The inhabitants of the earth are mentioned there as well. They are the ones who end up, as it were, selling their soul for various kinds of economic or political favors that they can obtain from the mighty empire. In verse 3, the angel tells John that he's going to take him out into the wilderness to be able to actually see the judgment of the prostitute. Now, in most of the places throughout the Old Testament, the wilderness is this uninhabited, barren place. Maybe not literally, and certainly here when we're talking about Babylon or Rome, it's not a literal uninhabited, barren place, but it is as if it were. It's a wonderful metaphor for that. We've also already seen within the pages of Revelation, back in chapter 12, that the wilderness has actually become a very different kind of place. It is the place to which the woman who had the child, to which she fled to be taken care of by God for a time, times, and half a time. Now in that very place, as an indication of how God is taking care of God's woman, as it were, we're going to see the woman that is Rome or Babylon begin to be judged out there in the wilderness. She's wearing scarlet. It's a sign of great wealth. The beast is scarlet. She's wearing scarlet and purple. She also has other signs of great wealth. She has gold on her, as well as precious gems and other precious stones. She means to look regal. She means to look glamorous. She means to appear very attractive. And if you don't look very close, you might in fact think that that's precisely the case. But notice for sure that this beast on which she is sitting has 7 heads and 10 horns and blasphemous names. Not only does that recall for us the family resemblance, as it were, to the dragon itself, but it also identifies this creature on which she is sitting as the Roman Empire itself. So we're close to being able to know precisely who this woman is. When I read these words about the facade that she has, that she's trying to make everybody think that she is so regal and attractive looking, I'm reminded of a novel that I have read many times over the years. It's actually a piece of early science fiction that has stood up very well to the passage of years. It was written in the late 1950s by Walter Miller. It's a canticle for Leibowitz. You may think that science fiction just can't be good literature, but this one is. It's a piece of post-apocalyptic literature that picks up the story after a nuclear holocaust. And if you especially if you grew up in the Catholic Church and can remember masses that were in Latin, you would just thrill as you read your way through this book, because there is much that picks up the story of a time through the Middle Ages when they find things and protect them in monasteries and continue copying them and so forth. If you want a good book to read, I would encourage you to read Walter Miller's A Canticle for Leibowitz. I mention that here because there's a point in the book where there is a docile curtain that is behind where the monks, as it were, are doing their thing. And from a distance, the docile curtain just looks absolutely regal. It is scarlet. It looks almost voluptuous. But as you get up close to it, you can see that it is dirty and it is stained and it is threadbare, and you wonder how it can even remain standing, as it were, behind the altar that is there. That's the way this woman is as well. If you are at a distance, she really looks grand, but when you get up close, you realize there's really just not much at all there to entrance you. Intriguingly, what we're told in verse 5 is that she too has a title on her forehead. We might have thought that 666 was only on the little people like you and me, but here the great woman herself bears a mark on her forehead. She is owned just as much as any person is in the world. It's not the mark of Christ. It's not the sealing that God has done for all of God's people. This is that mark that is placed on the heads of persons because of the beast. Verse 6 says that she is drunk with the blood of God's people, those who bore testimony to Jesus. It's a remembrance here that she is, at least in some degree, responsible not only for the death of Christ, but the martyrdom now of God's people through the latter part of the first century. If we pause right at this point, we can, I think, realize that John is most likely greatly astonished. He had expected, as he went into the wilderness, to see the judgment of this woman. But what he is seeing instead is a woman that has about her great wealth and ostentation. She's still very proud. And he is, at the end of verse 6, as it were, afraid that she's going to be able to get away with her crime. But then we move into verse 7 and we realize that that is not at all what is going to happen. Verses 7 through 18 are going to provide for us a kind of interpretation of the actual destruction of this woman, of the prostitute, as well as the beast on which she is riding. So verse 7 the angel tells John that he's going to provide to him now the interpretation of her destruction. And we're reminded here that the beast is in fact 7-headed and 10-horned, where he's attempting to be omniscient and omnipotent. Verse 8 mentions that the beast once was, now is not, and will come again. Yet one more attempt to be like God, who was, is, and shall be, but not quite being able to pull it off. The inhabitants of the earth, you'll notice here again, we've referred to those over and over throughout the pages of Revelation. These are those non-Christians, the people who are not the people of God, who back in chapter 13 were worshiping the beast. Here they are astonished at the sort of divine persona that is being displayed both by the beast as well as by the woman. It's verse 9 that should capture our attention, though, because here we're beginning to have the interpretation provided for us. The 7 heads of the beast, we are told, are in fact 7 hills. That really is key, because we know, as well as the ancients knew, that Rome was and is the city on the 7 hills on the left bank of the Tiber River. That is a clue that would have been absolutely clear to John's readers, just exactly the same way that for us, any mention of the White House or 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is clear to us. We would not say where, what, we would know exactly what is being referred to. And even though it's in England, if somebody mentioned 10 Downing Street, we probably even know what that represents, that is in fact where the Prime Minister lives. The angel tells John that you need a mind with wisdom to be able to understand these things. That's his way, I think, of not so much saying that you need a PhD to be able to figure this out, but rather you need to pay attention. Think, use your brain, and if you do, you will see very clearly who this woman is, what she represents, and how best to stay out from underneath the powers that she does have. Verse 10 takes the analogy a little bit further. Not only are the 7 heads 7 hills, but they are also 7 kings. And it is at this point that we really just have to acknowledge that John is now moving into a local description of sorts here that we really just do not understand. Most likely his original readers in the first century would have known exactly what he was referring to, which of the 7 kings, for instance, he was meaning for them to understand. But I think we just have to acknowledge that from the distance that we are from the text today, we just really do not know. And if you think that we should, think for just a moment about political cartoons, which is, in a sense, what it is we're reading right here. It's a metaphor. If we go back to, say, a political cartoon like the one that you can see on the slide right now, Benjamin Franklin's snake that is in pieces, that will ultimately become one of the Revolutionary War flags, that looks to us like it's a snake that's been chopped into pieces. but really is a snake that has not yet come together. This is, in many ways, the very first of political cartoons that was published in an American newspaper. When we look at it, because of the symbols that are on the page and with it saying join or die, we can figure it out that this is Benjamin Franklin saying that if we, these American colonies, do not unite, we do not stand a chance to be able to stand against Britain. And so, while there may be details we don't completely understand, we can at least get the gist of it. But that's 250 years ago. Let's move to a political cartoon that's only 125 years ago. Look at this political cartoon. Do you have a clue what this one is about? I mean, you can see a gentleman, you can see, well, a donkey, and it tells you Democratic Convention. What on earth is going on in this? If you're a historian, you might be able to sort out at least some of the details. You see that the donkey has some wounds that it hasn't quite recovered from. One saying 1896, one saying 1900. It's a messed up pair of wings that it's trying to take flight from, and there's this gentleman off to the side looking almost like a bozo clown. Well, it's William Jennings Bryan getting ready to be nominated for the third time as the Democratic nominee to run for president, and the cartoonist is suggesting, what on earth makes you think that you're going to have any better luck on this your third time than you've had on the two previous occasions? We can figure it out, but just barely. But what if we were to go to a British cartoon or to a French cartoon from the 1600s? It doesn't take much for us to begin to realize we just have really no way to be able to understand the details of those old political cartoons. In fact, if we were to look at a cartoon that was running in a newspaper in San Francisco, chances are very good we wouldn't get it any more than somebody in San Francisco would get one that was running here in Springdale, Arkansas. It's just the nature of political cartoons. And there's a sense in which what we're reading right here in the book of Revelation is precisely the same way. We can get the general gist, but the details really begins to push beyond what we can gather. That said, two things in verses 11 and 12. What you see there is verse 11, I think, really has just one thing for you to understand. The angel is telling John that the end is near. In fact, the end has come. Rome, or Babylon as it were, cannot last. It is doomed. It cannot stand as it is. If you get that, you get the point here of chapter 17. Verse 12 does mention 10 horns. These are the powers that are represented, the omnipotence, as it were, of the beast. That almost surely is a reference to emperors, Roman emperors, and in fact, at this particular point in time, if in fact the book is written during the time of Domitian as emperor, then there have in fact been 10 emperors prior to Domitian, starting with Augustus Caesar and running up through Domitian's brother Titus, who had been emperor just prior to him. And you'll see on the slide here those 10 emperors listed for your ability to look at there. In verses 13 and 14, those 10 horns exist in a sense. In fact, their only purpose, it is stated here, is to lend authority to the beast's war against Jesus Christ. But by this point, we should understand that there's really very little that they can do against Jesus, because as it's pointed out here, Jesus is the Pantocrator. He is the world ruler, and he truly is the omnipotent, omniscient one, and Jesus cannot be overcome because he is the Pantocrator, or the ruler of all that is. If you've not heard that term, that's precisely what we celebrate within the church on the very last Sunday of the church year, as well as the very first Sunday of the church year. So here in just a few weeks, we are going to be celebrating Jesus as Pantocrator, or the way we will put it is that he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It's how we end the church year. It's how we start the church year. Jesus cannot be overcome by this beast or even by the dragon, and most certainly not by the woman. In fact, not only can he not be overcome, he is precisely the one who can help us, as he told us back in chapters 2 and 3. He is the one who can help us to be able to overcome the woman and the beast and the dragon. The final verses of this chapter refers to the woman and the beast sitting there on the waters, and we're told that the waters are actually representing the rest of the earth. They are the people on which she is sitting. It's a terrible description, but it's a description that will make sense to us. The empire is, as it were, using its population for its own ends. It does not exist in order to enable its people. It simply uses them for whatever it wants. Well, that is a situation that simply cannot last. Verse 16 suggests the day is coming very quickly when the empire will in fact turn on the empire. The empire's people will turn upon Rome itself. And the description that you find there in verse 16, which may seem a little repulsive, talking about fire and nakedness and the eating of flesh, just realize that that's not John making that up. He's simply, once again, taking this metaphor from within the pages of the Old Testament. He's taking it from passages such as Ezekiel 23 and Zechariah 14 and Haggai 2 and weaving them together in this tale that shows us that the empire simply has no future to look forward to. Well, that's the very thing that Jesus told us. Verse 17, the moral of the story is that evil is ultimately self-destructive, that a house that is divided against itself cannot stand. And we know that to be true, and here we're shown just how true it really is. Chapter 17 then ends with verse 18 telling us in no uncertain terms that the prostitute herself is in fact Rome. Back in chapter 1, we were given an interpretation to kind of help us along as we worked our way through this book by telling us what the 7 stars referred to and what the 7 lampstands were. Here we're told who the woman truly is. Her identity is divulged to us so that we can put everything together here as the book is coming to its conclusion. Chapter 18 opens up as a kind of funeral dirge for Rome. And it's modeled on several different passages in the Old Testament. Ezekiel 26 through 28 refers to the fall of Tyre. And then there are several chapters in Isaiah, chapters 13 and 14 and 21, as well as a couple chapters in Jeremiah 50 and 51 that refer to the fall of Babylon. And if you were to take time to read through those chapters, you would see that John has taken almost all of what he says here in chapter 18 of Revelation from those particular chapters, looking at the fall of previous empires to describe the fall of the empire of Rome. So we start off once again with an angel. Every time these angels appear, they are speaking a message that is, as it were, beginning to introduce for us another scene that builds on those that we've looked at before. And so here we have another angel providing us an introduction to yet another scene. Verse 2 talks about Babylon as being a home for demons and a haunt for evil. Well, that's the last way that we would tend to describe the main city of Babylon or the main city of Rome or the main city of any empire. It's certainly not a wilderness or a desert or a haunt for evil things, and yet that's how it's being described here for John. It's a way of saying that the destruction that Babylon is going to have to undergo, that Rome is going to have to undergo, is going to in fact be total. It will be as if, as it were, that there's just nothing living within the midst of that urban situation. The urban metropolis will be absolutely as desolate as the wilderness itself is. And look at verse 3. There are two reasons that are given here for Rome's fall. The first is idolatry, emperor worship, and instead of worshiping the true God, here they are worshiping the wrong God. They are worshiping the dragon-authorized beast, the empire itself. And the second reason for the fall of the empire is their economic wantonness, their greed, as it were. Well, that one might catch us a bit by surprise, but there it is. We don't tend today to think of greed as a deadly sin. We think of greed as one of the greatest virtues of our day. But this may just be one of those places that we need really to take to heart and remember that greed is deadly. It is not something that we should think we're entitled to be able to have in our lives. Verse 4 introduces a theme that we're going to see on a couple other occasions, and it's worth pointing out here. Even in the midst of all of the destruction that is beginning to settle in on the empire itself, here is God proclaiming in a loud voice that there is yet time for those who are not God's people to come out from Babylon, to come out of Rome, to come out of all that you have been worshiping and paying attention to in ways that you should not. There is still time to repent, to change sides, as it were. Mercy is a constant of God, and for that we can be very grateful. It's a companion even of the very moments when God realizes there is a need for punishment, as it were. Whether it's an exodus from Sodom in the pages of Genesis, or an exodus from Egypt and the plagues in the book of Exodus, there is always opportunity for folks to leave the life that they have lived and switch sides, to repent and accept that which God offers to them. Verse 5 makes it clear why it's necessary to do that, because if you stay behind, the sins that have already been piled up to heaven make punishment very certain upon that great city. There really is nothing more really to say about the great city at this point, but look at verse 7. There is the woman herself right up to the very last moment, in complete denial of all that is happening to her and all that is around her. She continues to think that she sits as queen and she is every bit in the right and nothing at all can happen to her. She refuses to believe that her end has come near, that it is in fact in sight. She is in denial that there is any problem within her empire or any problem with her. And because of that denial, her end will come, as it were, in a flash, in a moment, suddenly. But it's only suddenly because she has been in denial of all that she has seen up to this point. Think back to the plagues, for instance. It's not just one plague. There are 7 plagues. When we go back into the pages of Exodus itself, there are 10. And it takes a long time before you get finally to that very last plague in which there is the death of the firstborn. So the case is here. It's only because of her denial that there is any problem, that it seems as if it is just sudden as can be. Verse 8 says it will be, as it were, in one day. Very certain, very sudden, with no warning. It will just collapse like a house of cards, as opposed to some long, slow, gradual, drawn-out kind of siege. And that brings us then to verses 9 through 20, which are really intriguing. It is a kind of lament that is spoken by 3 different groups of people. Up to this point in chapters 17 and 18, we've been able to sort of look in on the fall of the empire from inside, as it were. But now beginning in verses 9 and running all the way up to verse 17 at least, we're going to stand outside of Rome and look in on Rome and see what is happening. And we're going to look through the lens of 3 different groups, through the eyes of kings, through the eyes of merchants, and through the eyes of seamen. So first of all, with the kings, this is the lament that you hear in verses 9 and 10. Rome really is an empire, but outside the empire, it does business, as it were, with other nations, with other countries. These countries are beginning to cry as they see Rome come to an end because their lucrative relationship with Rome has come to an end. But notice that even though Rome is ending and they are weeping over her, they refuse to lift a finger to help Rome. They don't help, they don't stand with her, they simply cry out because her time is at an end. And look at what they call her. They call her a city of power. Well, that's what kings deal in, isn't it? But notice something here. Even with the fall of Babylon, this is not the end of the world. Rome's fall doesn't mean that the end of time has come. It just means Rome is at an end, or the empire is at an end. And then there's verses 11 through 17. The second group begin now to put forth their lament. And these are the merchants. First of all, the kings. Secondly, now, the merchants. They're upset in verse 11 because of the collapse of all the major markets that Rome dabbled in. Their financial gain, in other words, has been cut off. Way back in chapter 2, I mentioned just almost in passing how it was that Rome was situated in such a way that it did business with nations as far away as India, Japan, and China, and all of that commerce came across Asia and came ultimately, for the most part, to the port right there at Ephesus, where it would then be put upon ships and then brought over to the mainland of Greece and of what we would call Italy itself, Rome. And so all of these various nations that have done business, the merchants that are doing a lot of the transporting across land or even across the seas, they're the ones who now realize that they are losing out as well. Verses 12 and 13 have a rather remarkable list of 28, I think it is, in all commodities that are mentioned. Now, John didn't come up with those particular items that are mentioned. Once again, this is something that he has taken from the Old Testament. And if you read the book of Ezekiel in chapter 27, that's where you'll find these commodities listed in the fall of Tyre. And he has simply pulled those over to show us how complete is going to be the fall of the empire in the book of Revelation. All of those commodities can be grouped, I think, into maybe 6 or 7 different types of commodities. There are precious metals and gems, for instance. There are fabrics. There are ornamental pieces of various kinds, perfumes and aromatics, different kinds of food or spices. And then the last category is animals and even slave traffic that the empire dealt in. Mentioning of slave traffic, it was a bit different than the chattel slavery that our own nation has had to endure. But that said, there are estimates that there were as many as 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire in the first century alone. So the number of people that we're talking here is just astronomical. The kings described Rome as a city of power. The merchants described Rome as a city of merchandise, bringing up the idea of consumers, consumerism, or consumption is the term that is often used as well. In our own day, consumption is sort of the lifeblood of our society, and yet it wasn't all that long ago that we realized that consumption was not a good thing. Consumption was, in fact, a very terrible disease that ate you up from the inside out. It was a disease in which you seemed to just waste away. It is amazing that consumption has become for us a good thing, in which it seems that all we talk about are jobs and money and the ability to buy and sell things, and it has even become a kind of amusement for many people today. But here It is one of the reasons that the nations are crying, because Rome has become a city of consumption, a city of merchandise and selling and buying. In the Talmud, there is a place where the rabbis say that in the world there are 10 treasures that have been shared by God. Somehow or other, Rome got its hand on 9 of those treasures. The final treasure is shared between all of the other nations in the world by itself. Rome then being 9/10 of all of the treasures that the first century world would have known. You see that a little bit, that idea that all that is important here is within the empire. Merchants have sold themselves off to Rome and are delighted in what they've been able to obtain from Rome and get from Rome. But now they too stand off and simply cry because Rome is no more. The final group that you see in verses 17 through 19 are the seamen, the shipping industry, as it were. Today we might think in terms of railroads or the long haulers, the trucking industry. But nevertheless, it is those who transport the goods that ultimately make their way to Rome. And they too simply cry that Rome is no more, but just like the merchants and just like the kings, they do not lift a finger to help. So intriguing. The empire that thought that it was so unified, when it comes down to the end, is not united whatsoever. It is divided and falls. Verse 20 is another one of those verses that may haunt us just a bit. The rejoicing that we see, though, in verse 20, I think, is rejoicing not so much because of the evils that are befalling Rome at this particular junction of its existence, but rather because its power and its idolatry has been broken. Empire represents a way of life that just simply cannot last. There is nothing sustaining or sustainable about that which the empire has had in its life. This particular understanding that we see in verse 20 is also something that John has picked up from the pages of the Old Testament. In other words, it is a kind of stylized description of defeat that he has simply picked up from what he knew as Scripture. Well, we know what stylized descriptions of defeat are like in our own day. They don't look like this, but we do know what they look like when we read a book or when we watch a film, because they're always exactly the same, especially when we're watching a movie. Movies always, when they come right down to it, there is a chase scene that takes place, if it's any kind of an action movie. And finally there comes this moment in which it looks as if the protagonist or the good guy is going to get the bad guy, and he chases him into a corner only to have something happen and the roles are reversed, and now the enemy has the protagonist in a corner and pulls his pistol or his gun and points it at the protagonist, and for the first time in the entire movie, instead of just blasting away, decides to have this long 5-minute conversation in which he explains everything in the movie to the protagonist, who lies there seemingly helpless. And finally, when the enemy decides, okay, I've told you everything that you need to know, now I'm going to pull the trigger, we simply discover that the protagonist has a hidden gun, or the sidekick has shown up just off screen and blows the bad guy out of the water. It's the way it is a stylized form of the ending of the book, the ending of the movie when the protagonist wins. Verse 20 is a stylized description of the ending of the power of the empire. And that leaves then verses 21 through 24. This shows you, in a very real sense, the actual destruction then of Babylon. This particular scene comes from Jeremiah 51 and describes initially the internal collapse from within Rome and shows three different reasons for why Rome ultimately falls. You see those reasons given in verses 23 and 24. If you've read Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he has 10 reasons. John here at the tail end of the book of Revelation has only 3. Verse 23, the third part of that verse, he says that the first reason is because Rome's merchants became as great as kings. They had, as it were, misplaced priorities. Instead of giving their allegiance to God, they gave them to the empire. The heroes in that particular age were the emperors themselves, the ones who took upon themselves the glory that ultimately should have been due to God. In our own day, our heroes are no longer politicians or kings or regal figures. They are entertainers. They are movie stars and singers and sports figures. But in the same way, if we have listed them, as so many people have, as the priorities in life, those whom we model ourselves after, rather than modeling ourselves after, as it were, God's saints, or even more specifically Jesus, then our priorities have also been misplaced. The second reason that is given for the fall of the empire, the fall of Rome, is the very last part of verse 23. It is idolatry. They have set themselves up as God themselves. And so instead of giving allegiance to God, they have given allegiance to the empire. There's a false sense of security that Rome had. And then the final reason that is listed is there in verse 24. And this may seem a little surprising. It doesn't seem at all to be quite as big as the other two. But when we think about it, we see just how important it really is, especially from the perspective of God's people. It is the blood of the Christian martyrs. Rome has set itself up as that entity which intends to do away with God and God's people. The blood of the Christian martyrs not only becomes the way that the church is enabled to have seed that continues prospering into the future, but it is that which moves God to say enough is enough and put an end to the empire. Well, that's the destruction of Rome. He looks at it very quickly. It is a rush job through the fall of Rome in chapters 17 and 18. Now, next week, and then the week after that, we will spend much more time very slowly working our way through that which exists when the empire ceases to be. In other words, with the arising of God's kingdom in the place of the dragon's kingdom, what shall it be like? Well, it's going to be a fun time for us to see what it looks like when heaven, in fact, comes to earth. And that's where we'll pick up next week when we come back together. Thanks for being a part of the lesson today.